Okay, good evening, everybody, and you're very welcome to this evening's John Broderick Writer in Residence Book Club with our special guest, Oein de Bhairduin, all the way from Tuam in County Galway. Great, there's a lot of enthusiasm and applause there for your presence, Oein, and completely justified. I'd like to thank, first of all, Westmeath County Council and the Arts Council of Ireland for the support not only of the residency and of my role as writer in residence, but of this event tonight. So thanks to both of those national institutions who are assisting us continually to better the arts and better our communities. Now, we're all here this evening to discuss this absolutely gorgeous publication. I can't say enough about it. Brought out from the relatively new but masterful editors in Skein Press. This is their second publication, I believe, came out in 2020. And Oein just told me yesterday that it's going for its re-edition. It's in the process now of being re-edited, thanks to being sold out for being such an amazing book. And we're going to see why today, for those of you who haven't read it. So my name, by the way, is Keith Payne, and thanks for joining me, everybody. And I'd also like to thank Kerry-Ann McManus, who is driving the bus for us this evening, and she knows where all the gears and the wheels and the radio is, so she's in control of the bus. So sit back and enjoy Kerry's masterful handling. Oein, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Really a great pleasure to have you with us tonight. Now, Oein, you're originally from Tuam in County Galway. You're an author, a herbalist, a community representative, a community activist, and a member of the Minkeri, the traveling community. And I'd like to start off with a question about education, because you really highlight in this book how from such a young age you were learning. You were learning these stories from your father and others. You were learning recipes and lore and herbalism from your mother and your grandmother and the wider community. And then you found yourself in NUIG studying psychology. Can you talk to me a little bit about this so-called formal education versus the broad, deep education you've received and chased yourself throughout your life?
I can. First off, hello everybody, delighted to be here. And one of the first things I know I discussed with Keith when he invited me on was that it wasn't going to be the usual kind of strict interview kind of session, but more open to the discussion, because I love actually discussing, because that's where we actually can meet and greet and understand a bit more. So in regards to education, I think that both strands of education are incredibly important. Traditional, relaxed, kind of casual settings as well as the formal both have places in our life. What becomes conflictive is that when one is seen as being superior to others. For instance, while in my own skill sets, for instance, at a very young age, we were taught things like basically like herbalism, foraging, kind of hunting styles, craft, which might not really present itself very well within academia, but will be essential to the generations of our people and your own people and everybody's people surviving. However, in the last, I say, 2 generations almost, that focus and those needs of life-preserving skills have fallen away in light of something else. And I think that much needs to be done to draw things back to balance. I am always very suspicious on a very kind of personal level of people who streamroll and only look for the academia, because I think that offsets people's options, and they're open to them to formal education, especially in 3rd level. What avenues are actually available for people, life situations, resources, not just financial, but also kind of like a kind of people-wise, childcare. There's a whole kind of bubbles there. And so when it comes to education, I think that all knowledge is valuable, not just those that are given in the halls of academia.
Yeah. And did you find access to formal education easy to come by as a member of the traveling community?
Well, when my yearly engagement with 3rd level was never through the lens of a traveller. Most people would just assume on meeting me that I'm not a traveller, which I've used to my advantage at times. Although from like I'm originally from Tuam, which is the highest population of travellers in the country per population. But I would have said that while avenues of access were there, especially coming from a family where both parents were blessed to have employment, or we had a solid accommodation setting, like health and kind of those care of family was quite kind of stable. I would say though the biggest barrier was the assumption I wasn't going there, or had no interest, and that those avenues weren't something I had interest in. And I think that lack of encouragement or the expectation of like, I'm not going to follow those, would later on review of like the kind of experience, especially in secondary school, did create barriers, because it's very hard to believe in yourself when people of authority don't. It's very hard to see yourself in places where you don't see your cultural identity reflected. I mean, in 2016, our last kind of census, only 167 travellers out of a population of 40,000 had completed third level education.
Yeah.
So when we're so I mean, like, everyone wants their children to prosper. Everyone wants their children to have a good education and you know, and have access and to have prosperity. So when we're not seeing those pathways forward, we need to really review it in a way that doesn't just leave blame on, oh, lack of interest, because like every parent wants their child to prosper. So people aren't following those avenues. We need to know why. Is there like for ourselves, like we're in situations where I know my first year of college where a lecturer did suggest that stated that travellers came from the famine times, which is not accurate. No, like studies upon studies, genetic studies show that we're like far beyond that. But I suppose aspects like that really shows that this space isn't for me because they don't understand me. And while that sounds like a small event, that did send a very strong ripple of like how accepting would the space be of me? Would I be critiqued, or would I be just seen as the good traveller? Which is something that people fall into. I'm going, like, for instance, going, travellers have as many problematic and wonderful people as the wider community. You know, we have full license to be as wonderful and as boring as everybody else. However, the stories we usually hear about travellers are usually singular on one thread, rather than showing us as an aspect of the wider diversity of just being human.
So a notion of a top-down assumption that members of minority communities want just as much as the general public to attend education and have access to formal education. And you mentioned there genetic studies, and it reminds me of something. I mean, I agree with you. We've lost so much of this knowledge and the respect for this knowledge. And yet, for example, recent DNA global mapping has proven that, in fact, the Milesian invasion that's talked about in the Lower Gaval and Heron from over 1,000 years ago is based on fact. Or even the far reaches of theoretic physics talks about something called dark matter that's whizzing all around us. And it does, in fact, prove, or they're trying to prove, that what you say in your book, that the world is alive all around us. And it seems to me that they, or we, are catching up with the storytellers and with this great and deep lore. I mean, it's like a great friend of mine, a doctor, said the other day, we should listen to our grannies more. There's a reason they knew these things. It's because they worked. So thinking about storytelling and the role of storytelling in your life, can you talk to us a little bit about that?
I think storytelling has always been a main aspect of my life. I think depending on how other people would consider storytelling, they probably would realize that storytelling is also a main aspect of their lives.
Yeah.
And just that we define storytelling in very different ways. Now, I was introduced to storytelling in very kind of traditional settings at the early age, like campfires, like time that were set aside just for storytelling, as well as those that were naturally interwoven in everyday existence. But there are means for us to explore, to remember, ways for us to forget things as well. Sometimes we've been taught things that are not true, and getting new stories helps us to unwind those understandings and helps us to forget them. But also, they show that we are part of a much greater lineage. The stories are not ours; they come through us. Even the stories that we think to self-generate, aspects of those stories come from somewhere. Either someone else's story, an experience that you shared, an impact someone's had on you, your biases, your fears, your joys, your passions. They all become part of the story. And the story, and even the story, how we present ourselves to the world, that's a part of our narrative. That's a part of what we're trying to construct. A way not only to send something out there, but to create a space where people can also reach back and we can actually come to a shared understanding. And I think that the storytelling is vital for human surviving. And it's vital for our empathy to one another, but also it's vital to have a sense of what it is to be human in all its aspects, especially parts of our part of identity we may never actually experience directly for ourselves. Because I will never know what it's like to be a mother, but I will have some understanding from the stories of mothers. And so they, so there's those things that unless we actually start sharing them in a real, honest, open, and like the kind of human way, we become kind of like those aspects of fiction. Rather than people who are trying to understand each other in a real, honest, authentic way.
And so what's your role then as the storyteller, Owen?
But most of my role with kind of storytelling is kind of a responsibility. So within the kind of the cultural concept of kind of Traver folklore specifically, it usually comes with three main aspects. The first aspect is to always identify where a story comes from. You know, because you are a part of the lineage, not just the origin of that story. Even if you highly adapted or you know, put new characters or aspects into it, it's a part of a movement, it's a part of it, like a wave. And I said, well, you come with a responsibility to pass it on, even if it's just to a single person, because to have a story die on your lips is a terrible loss to all those people again behind you. And the third responsibility is to say it in a way that's truthful, regardless of how fantastic it is, because it does carry at its core aspects of someone's truth and someone's reality. And so I think as a storyteller, I'm someone who's trying to facilitate and maintain and share that as much as possible.
Well, I think now is just the perfect time to hear one of these stories. And we can talk about some of the issues afterwards. So, Owen, have you something you'd like to tell us? Any particular story that you fancy telling?
No, I decided I'd flick through the book.
Great.
And where it fell, it fell.
Yeah.
And so we'll see where it goes. Stop. No, this wasn't planned. You know, otherwise I've gone on. We're reading this story.
Yep.
So I'm actually going to read An Bheor Tulla Mala Swart, which is The Women Who Gather.
Excellent.
And this is I quite like this story because originally, I had to disclaim at the end, but originally I had seen the story through very, very different eyes. And then as I became older, I started seeing other truths in it. So this is how it starts. The first story I recall telling was a tale I heard at school. I was about 9. I sat on a small wooden chair in the backyard and watched my father and neighbour cut sods of soil in the garden in an attempt to dig out the foundation of a small shed that was never to be. The groove was marked that this day still exists, and each time I see it, I'm reminded of the sharing of stories. The tale I heard at school was about the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. They hid in a cave from some soldiers, and a kind spider weaved a web so thick that the entrance of the cave that the soldiers did not venture in, deciding that no one had passed that way in many a year. I had only half heard it before I decided I was going to pass it on. I was a small wisp of a Subling, short in words and shy in company, but the anticipation of sharing a tale to retell filled my footsteps home with a subtle joy and a loud excitement. I remember telling the story and feeling proud of it, feeling as tall as if I was standing in the chair rather than sitting on it. My father stood for a short time to listen to me, with his chin resting on top of his hand that lay on the handle of the shovel, his grey eyes regarding me kindly until I finished. After a while, he returned to shoveling the soil aside and told me the tale of where spiders had come from and why we still wear the red cords upon our wrist. Once there were old women who would travel the land and carrying tightly woven willow baskets to guard the falling bark of crab apples, wilting St. John's plants, and any fresh beetroots that they could find. They plucked the flax that grew brazenly on the roadside and the wool that was snarled with thorns of brambles, hawthorn trees and firs. They dressed mostly in black, with the edges of the garments that were lined in red, white and yellow. Some of the women had additional stripes on the dresses of different colours, one for each of their children, living or departed. Their long hair was plaited in firm braids, and about their hips there were small beady pockets embellished with medals and tokens of buttons that they were tied. Every evening they would boil and dye the wool red in the big cast iron pots that rested in the campfire in the heart of the molly in which they lived. During the night they would continue to spin and weave the cord that rendered them red for young children. They would sing songs of hope and melodies of joy in a chorus of sweet voices, with their minds of clear intent, stirring and carding and weaving thoughts and prayers into the chords of the young. At dusk they would gather, at night they would labour, and as dawn came they would rest peacefully in their beds. And this is how it was for a very long time. However, as the years moved on and wore on, and more children were born into the world, and the old women who had gathered began to struggle to keep pace with their labours. They worked and they worked and they worked to make the cords of red, the colour of blood, the tones of deep fire and iron rust. Despite the struggle, they decided they would keep weaving the cords, and one day would weave a cord long enough to encircle the entire world, so that no child will be without the care of a loving blessing. Dawn and dusk, night and day blended into one as the work continued, and the old women who gathered forgot to stop to eat and rest. Over time, their fingers, once kissed a soft pink with dye, became darker and darker, some brown from the dust of the ashes, others black from the coals of well-stocked fire that kept the dying pot boiling. Still, the old women who gathered worked on. The molly, which was once filled with songs and dances of joy, became silent as they focused more and more on their task. The sweat from their brows began to wash away the red from their cords, and they became silken grey gossamer. In time, the cords became thinner and then more delicate as filigree, but at the core, they held their strength. Still, the old women who gathered worked on. They grew thin and bony as neither slumbering nor feasting, and they began to shrink. Some of the old women who gathered worked away one or two of their own fingers away, while others kept their gathering baskets so tightly strapped to their backs, not bothering to take them off between gathering, dyeing, and weaving of the cords. Their heart remained warm and their task remained their focus. In time, the old women grew smaller and smaller, less of this world and more of another, until one day they looked little more than a bundling of fingers, spinning and weaving with the gathering baskets on their back, adorned with stripes and shades that once belonged to the dresses and beanie pockets. They had become the very first spiders, and even now they continue their work, spinning onwards and onwards across the world. And a sense of protection, especially from those cords. In modern times, many of the mink carry still wear and tie the cords. They're made of red and white for Philomena of protection, to avoid being overlooked. The light blue cords of healing, and the white silken cords Mary, the entire of knots. Thank you.
Marvelous, bravo! That was absolutely beautiful. Thank you, Owen. And what's funny is I can hear the lads in your, I think it's in your area, who are cutting the grass there, who are working while you're telling us about work. They're working away. But of course, isn't that so much a part of storytelling, that everything in the moment, in the place you are, when it is, where it is, it's all pulled into the story, isn't it?
No, it is. I think that, and the stories are adaptable because they need to be. For instance, if I'm at the edge of a lake, I'm not really going to talk about the heights of a mountain when the lake is about me. You know, it's a way to engorge people into the not suspension of disbelief, but the idea of becoming a living part of the story. And I think that one of the things that, one of the reasons why I stopped on that page when it came up is that most people, when we think and talk about Travers, only know issues, and you know, they actually don't know culture. And we would be surprised that many people, once they start identifying cords, because many Travers wear cords on the wrist, different things. Once you realise this, you realise, oh my God, I've never noticed the Travers wear cords on the wrists. Yeah. And it's such a point of kind of cultural celebration. So even that idea of something that can be so visible within people can be so very overlooked because the stories they've heard are of different things. So stories like that, I think, remind us to make sure that we look again.
And surely that has to be one of the huge impacts of this book. I mean, I learned so much about the traveling community just from reading it. Have you, I mean, I know you're touring constantly with the book, and you're doing events like this, and you're meeting communities online for the moment. Have you started to get a sense of realization of knowledge from the settled community thanks to the book, and maybe found the depth of culture of the traveling community reaching new audiences?
What I do know is that people are starting to realize and ask the question of where their other stories have gone. For instance, one of the things I've talked about, we talk about where the wren has the red breast, the robin has red breast, and where the wren is the king of all birds. And then you go, where's your other stories? Where are your other folk tales? Like where are those stories of like why that mountain is the shape of that mountain, or where that river came from? And so it's a reminder, kind of saying, rather than seeing it as a deficit culture, we were in a position that we were able to maintain something that you may not realize you may have lost in part.
Yep.
And that has opened up to a very different discussion of, rather than trying to establish for instance, some of the statements that people would say is almost like going, the traveling community is like 30 years behind the settled community. And that's starting to change with people realizing we're on a different road.
Yep.
The settled normative road isn't the only way. And our discussions, our understanding, like that many people may hold, that because they never have opportunities to critique them in a different way, doesn't make it any more or less valid than someone else's. So I think those discussions are happening in more ways than I've ever had them before. But I need my own kind of breadth of my consciousness, my own kind of mental health, the idea of having the opportunity to talk about community and culture and people and beauty, rather than what people associate with problems, has been incredibly a potent blessing into my life. And it's something I would really encourage people to continue. So rather than seeing us as the pictorial kind of stereotype kind of figures, realizing that we're people like other people, and the way that we can connect to each other is through our stories. And even the stories I may have forgotten, because our stories are part of the Irish narrative, part of the European narrative, part of the national narrative, and international narrative, and the ways that there's such a solid truth in a fairy told story, that we can actually start to see each other as people.
So, I mean, for the people watching today, and for those who want to watch this video later, and for other members of the public who you're talking to and telling your stories to, you said you know, people are starting to realize the lack of our stories when we hear yours. So where do people go to find their stories? Where's the source or the sources?
Um, Everywhere around it. The stories are not just in like our elder and our young, especially the youth that's very young, don't have the filters that we develop and will outpour, especially in retelling. But also learning how to tell the story of a land is very important. It's like the idea of where do you live and exist? What name does that have? What elder name does that have? Do you know why the land rears it the way it is? Why is that road? Is it a straight road or is it a windy road? Because chances are it's windy. It's there for a very long historical time, and it may have moved for trees and rivers or different homes. It's about looking back, because making sure that the knowledge that we have isn't important just because it's retrospective. It has an impact in our life. So the way is that, like with everybody has a story, and the only way that we can move forward is to start asking, and most certainly to start listening.
Yeah. And I think probably one of the greatest events in recent times for storytelling in Ireland was thanks to Katrina Crowe and her team bringing the census online. And that created a whole community and population of amateur archivists. And suddenly we've got access to our grandfather's signature, our great-grandfather's signature on that paper online. And this has encouraged people hugely to go searching back through the archives. But what about a place, I know now you live in Clondalkin, which is an area I'm studying myself at the moment, Clondalkin and Tala, and as they were built in the 80s, although both areas, Clondalkin has a deep Viking past, and Tala possibly back to a Phoenician past. But in a suburban housing estate where over 70% of the population live, newly built, relatively newly built, can the stories be excavated as easily as if it was a country road or a rural area by the River Shannon in Athlone, for example?
I think depending what kind of stories you're looking at, especially newly formed communities are going to be a patchwork of stories, which opens up the avenue of new stories and new creations, and that's just as valid as older stories of an area, because it's not because something is old doesn't mean it's more important. You know, and it's about what lives in people. So I think one is just to appreciate and explore the patchwork of where we are, and the other one would be to ask the questions of like what's around us. I think I should actually, before we had a conversation, but when I first moved to Clondalkin, my mother came to visit me as like the idea of like checking out where I'm living, what the neighbours like, all that stuff. And she spent a good few hours in Clondalkin, came back, and she was asking, so that tower is 1,500 years old. That's very interesting. And this there, and then how long is it there? And this new settlement. And her main question was, where are people buried? You know, I mean, going 1,500 years, you weren't walking to Bluebell, you're not going to tell it to bury your loved ones, right? There's a small graveyard on Monastery Road, there's an even smaller one beside the tower. Where are people buried? And then she had a sense of, you're building on them, right? And I've been living here some time, I had never asked, going, what was the life of people who were here before this new build? Like, where would they have lived? Where would they have worked? Where would they have spent time? And then you start realizing, kind of going, that because landscape can change, that we seem to have like forgotten it. But if you ask people, they remember, you know. And what we've discovered here is that Clondalkin didn't have a centralized graveyard as most you'd expect is found in most areas. They had several small ones.
Yes.
You know, and whilst again we're based on the assumption that most areas would have a centralized, and in fact it's because of the, I suppose, the changing of the landscape, the ground, soil depth. There was never any place that was like there would be put aside specifically for a large graveyard for a community, but several of them. And I think that if I hadn't had the sense of her perspective of this is how I survey the land, this is how I survey the people, I'd never have actually even thought of asking my neighbours of actually where are people buried, you know? And then even people who are newly here could tell you. They could tell you because other people told them. So it's a way of us kind of going that we won't know what depths we can dig to in an excavation until we actually start digging. Until we put the blade to the soil, it'll always be a theory. And I think we owe it to ourselves to give ourselves the opportunity to both fail at that exploration, but also just for the sheer love of it, to try it.
Yeah, and I mean, the last year has been the perfect time to investigate where you're from in your 5K radius, which actually gives you, I think, 13 square miles. So there's a huge amount of flora, fauna, history, folklore, stories in that apparent tiny area. And in fact, talking about Clondalkin and graveyards, there was a tiny little graveyard just off Newlan's Cross called St. Bridget's Graveyard. I discovered it the Tala Local Studies Group in the Tala Library, a wonderful map where it's online and going back to Roque's 1760 map to a contemporary, and you can pull like a screen curtain across. And you'll see Newlands Cross today, pull it across, and you can see Newlands Cross in 1760, which was called Shoulder of Mutton Cross.
Oh, wow.
And you can see the tiny little St. Bridget's graveyard just up from on the Boot Road, essentially.
Yeah.
So all these resources are there. And then just before I ask you to tell us another tale, I'm interested in this idea of storytelling and location. You mentioned earlier, if you're sitting by a lake, you wouldn't tell a story about a cliff face.
Mhm.
And the great storyteller John Broderick has a wonderful notion about storytellers, and he talks about the body of the room where we're all sat, the physical body of the storyteller, his mouth, his throat, his esophagus, his guts, the ears of the listener, all those physical spaces that reverberate with the storyteller. Is there an ideal location for you to tell a story in?
Well, I think, I don't know if idea, because we're always discovering new places to tell tales. And
Yeah.
like some tales need to be written, some tales need to be spoken. But like I do have a favour for the traditional campfires, because you move among people. And like there's this notion of sitting down and being a little bit less animated. Well, kind of growing up, the storytelling is like you're part of the story, because you can't help but part of the story, because the person's beside you, they're behind you, they're over there, they're beside your sister. You know, you're weaving up and down, and so like you are brought into into that world of that imagination and that retelling, or new telling. And yeah, but so I do have a love for that kind of that setting. I think like all settings have like virtues and vices. That's something I do have. I do a good bit of graph for, and it may obviously be influenced by growing up, and that's kind of not to romanticize the situation, but there's something raw about campfires and primal, and it just tears us away from this modern world of noise, and the idea of this symbol in front of us is a symbol that's shared among all of humanity. And here we are creating a light in the darkness, and the part of that light is a story.
Yeah. And kind of while we're around that light and that fire, listening and living the story, we're protected from all else outside, at least during that storytelling.
Yeah.
So and drawn to the light, as it were, you know. So speaking about this, let's all imagine we're around the campfire, and Owen, would you do us the great honor of telling us another tale, please?
I will. Actually, going to read this one, because it'll make sense at the end.
Okay.
This is called A Chris Fiend Tom Gilt. This is The Old Man in the Mountain. Very long time I can remember. I have adored visits to the bog. I love the scent of the wild thistle and gorse, and the blend of coconut and the young lilies. The spring peat beneath my feet, and the trilling unveiling of unexpected plants proudly rooted in spaces where you would expect them to be barren. My ears would buzz the sound of leaping frogs and making their way from ditch to ditch, bounding into new waters in a course of splits and splashes, a beautiful song set against the background performance of fluttering blue butterflies. Despite taking joy in the space, I was never able to bring myself to enjoy working in the bog. I would watch the cutting of the turf by machine or by scatterogue. Then the sods would be lined up on the green grass, and after 2 days they would do the first turning, followed by the second turning and the standing of the sods. Then the feet would be tucked to the ground, and their tips would lean against each other and kept upright. Next, we watched the weather keenly, and if it was wet or heavy, we would turn the sods for a third time, a flip, so that the wetness would drain out of each cutting. The dry sods would be stacked and boxed and baled and bagged and carried home by wagon, or in better years, by a tractor. The sods would be openly thrown into the backyard to be reaped. They would have to be turned to the bog to find the precious cairons, the small little turf gems that would burn bright white like sun-cast diamonds, and were worth the time raking the ground with short sticks, swishing back and forth to the peak to unveil them. I couldn't count the prayers that we would send up to heaven, and for ashen rain clouds to be met us on the battlefield and off the turf, in hopes of the Sunday and Saturday off. Despite it all, I still remember warmly the annual slow drive home along the road, following the wagon of sods as it travelled. Our job was to collect the lucky sods. They would be inevitably thrown themselves from the wagon. We would be sure never to pass a single one, gathering up as we rolled behind them. Sometimes we would park and pick, but mostly we would just slow down, throw the door open, and we would out come a hand to whisk away the sod and placing it softly in the bag in the rear seat. Lucky sods were more than lucky, you see. There were omens and tellers of the year ahead. A superstition that one openly believed were kept in the way that most people keep such portents, on the side of caution. A bag of bad sods meant a bad year. Good sods and all would be well. The first of the turf reek to be burned in the homestead would be the best of all the sods. The tougher years my parents would have would ensure that we would turn our hands to the bog lines of other families. They would raise their sods in exchange for some of for ourselves at home. One Friday night during our bedtime stories, my father broke the news to us gently that we would be going to the bog the next morning. This plan was met with quick rising voices. My father, being a man that he is, cut through the chatter, distracting us and easily in the moment of the story. This story of a man, a woman, a goat, and the forming of a fire. There was once an old man who lived high up in the mountain. Each morning felt cold and wet, and at his very best like the bite of a late November evening. He was so old that when he first lived in the mountain, it was little more than a hill, no higher than a Shetland pony. Life was hard and the weather bitter. A thick smouldering of clouds clung to the peak, keeping out light and warmth, and most days were darksome and dim, even when the sun hung high in the sky. The old man lived in a wooden shack that creaked and moaned loudly along the gales that shouted through the many gaps in the roof and the wooden walls. The shack was small and cramped, as if it had been beaten into the crack of the mountainside. Inside there was only a meagre fire over which a blackened and battered skillet pot on, and beside it a short, stumpy chair which the old man had slept in. The cupboards they were mostly bare, except for a few small parcels of food the old man was able to forage in a single sorrowful-looking fork. There was neither a carpet on the floor nor a picture on the wall. The interior was just as grim, worn, and mournful as the exterior. Having once been a kind man, filled with the joys of youth and the mind of eagerly awaited new adventures, with the rolling of the years, the old man had grown so hard at the mountain itself. Life in the wild, lonely place had battered his heart. The old man was often cold and found his garments lacking. At first he would dress himself in the fallen leaves that the wind would sweep to him, and wrap supple willow branches around him from the struggling saplings that grew along the mountain. He stacked up his white seedy duff of dandelions as a cuff about his neck, and bound soft thistledown around his wrists and feet, and wore feathers into his jumper. However, as he grew colder and more aware of the gnaw, champ, and chaw of winter, he began to grow out his bristly beard. At first he grew to such a length that he was able to throw it over with one of his shoulders while the rest rolled down to his knees. Then it grew longer and enough that he could rest it on his back like a heavy waxen coat, while the rest barreled in front of him like long and wiry apron. After some time, it was long enough for him to keep him snug and warm, but he continued to let it grow and grow until some of the whiskers were tucked under his arms, around his neck, flung around over his head like the tail of a broom, and along his feet like white bristly shoes, and that he had stacked even high on his chair like a set of wild birds' nests. On it grew and on it grew until every corner of the shack was stuffed with the very edges, and it creaked with excess. His beard lined the floor, pushed high against the roof, and trailed under the gaps of the door, where it railed and rolled up and down much the mountain. And when the thought came to him, the old man would gather it up in the tips of his beard and stack it back up high on the summit of the mountain, almost like there was a taller mountain behind the shack itself. As more years came and went, the only visitors to the shack were the winds, the rain, the clouds, and gloom. So one day the old man heard the rap of knuckles on his door. Startled, he rose to his feet from his beard-clad chair by the fire and threw the door wide open with a deep roaring huff at the audacity of anyone to disturb his solitude silence. He met with a woman called Gidge. Gidge was tall and rugged, with a clutch of white wispy hair upon her head, piercing eyes like the August sky, and a weary crooked smile that hinted at the hidden laughter in her cheeks. Without any welcome from the old man of the mountain, she quickly took quick-paced steps into the shack. Shaking the coldness of her journey from her, she inched inside to the meagre fire in the corner. Before the old man could speak, Gidge told her of her search of a goat that had wandered off from the herd, how she had been searching for the poor creature for 3 whole days, and how its tracks came up across the mountain, but did not come down again. She lifted the lid of the old pot that hung on the fire with the foot off a climbing staff, and asked him if he had eaten her goat. The old man shouted that he had taken no goat, and that she should shift, move, and make her way back down the mountain. Gage dismissed the sharpness of his reply and told the old man that she trusted his words and that she was deeply tired and that her raw bones wanted slumber. She would rest by the fire until next morning. When the accidental host agreed, Gage had turned her hand quickly and took part of the old man's beard and parted it into a pillow which she could rest. As soon as her limbs had found their space in the weave and tangle of the bier, she was lost to a deep sleep. The old man, while bemused and bewildered by Gage's visit, began to ponder how long it had been since a visitor had come and realized he had forgotten how nice it was. Before returning to his own chair, he tucked his beard around her and above her and wished her the sweetest of dreams into the unfolding night. Next morning, the old man was woken by the sound of a door closing. The click of the latch jarred him back into the living world. Gage had left to continue his journey. From the lips of the old man came a deep, long sigh of relief. However, as the days trickled forward, that sound echoed around the empty shack and became a lingering whisper that reminded him of her absence. Before Gage's visit, the old man had the company of his own solitude, but now he simply felt alone. At night, his dreams were filled with glimpses of her. His nostrils caught now and again the light scent of her in parts of his beard. Her words remained in his ears, and some of the bristles kept the indentation of her sleeping form. One morning, some weeks after Gage's visit, the old man woke to the sound of a goat bleating near the door. Immediately, he thought of Gage and her lost goat. He decided he would return the goat to her. Tying a braided part of his whiskers to the goat as a lead, he inched his way down the mountain. Each step was a great effort of his beard, tangling and dragging at every stone, weed, twig, and crevice, until he struggled and staggered in search of Gage. His search for her led him up and down the country, trailing his mighty beard behind him, much of it becoming so knotted in some of the snares he passed, they would simply have to cut them off and then part along the way and continue his journey. Gage, however, was not easy to find. He looked to the dry lands to the south and to the valleys to the north, to the great waters of the west. Eventually, he made his way to the land's edge in the east. He met Gage on a fire along the eastern shore of Era, coming upon her as she gathered up crabs and cockles, and she was surprised to see him and to return the goat to her. She placed a tender kiss on his forehead and thanked him and invited him to sit beside her in the fire and rest as she had once done by his. He was welcome to keep company with her for as long as he wished. That night, the old man of the mountain took most of what was left of his beard and then made a blanket out of it, and which he and Gage sat well into the night, talking and whispering of life and wonder under the stars. The next morning, the old man cut the last of his beard, knowing that the presence of Gage was warm enough to see him through even the harshest of winters. And since that day, and since the old man's beard had been snared and cut away to become much what we now call boglands, and if it ever dug up and set aflame, it would share with you the warmth that was once felt between Gage and the old man.
Bravo, bravo. Absolutely stunning. Beautiful, beautiful telling. And it reminds me, Owen, you know, as you're telling us there, well, first of all, of the great kinship amongst all of us, all the various different tribes that live on the island and on all the islands, but also the notion that a story is a gift.
In natural settings, the events that happen around us change the story.
Yeah.
You know? And I think that's a very important part of modern storytelling that we'll be able to maintain from the ancient tales. Is that stories are alive, they're alive in us, and they need to be alive in us. And I know I'm after reading a story specifically because there's certain things in it I wanted to be able to capture. Because if I was to tell that story, and it's something I'd share with Keith, especially is when we're doing the audio recording of the book, one of the people who wanted to do the audio recording was my father. Yeah. And bless the man, like myself, cannot tell the same story twice. You know? And so sometimes when you want to tell a story, like kind of going, you're going, this is the tale, but it's not the detail, it's just a version of it. And I do think that like us having the freedom to tell them in different ways is something that we should encourage within ourselves. Yep. And in other people around us.
Absolutely. So you've mentioned it, there is an audiobook recorded on the way. What stage are we at?
Oh no, it's on the way. It's available from the Skein Press website.
Okay, so it's available now from Skein Press website. Great. So I think, Owen, we'll open it up to questions. Bridie Brian in Manchester.
Owen, I got your book during the week and I read it in one sitting.
Oh, really? Thank you.
It was like a feast of lyrical, poetic prose that I absolutely enjoyed. And there's a few lines that got me, but one of them was the seedy duff of dandelions as a cuff around his neck. How beautiful is that? You know, and I love dandelions. So you really got me in touch with nature, and I felt as if we've lost a lot about the herbs and the healing and all of that to do with nature. So thank you very much. It's wonderful.
Well, thank you very much. And I think that like a part of the storytelling that I try to do my best to capture in the work is that all of the stories originated with me recording them audibly. And when it came to change them, it was all done auditory. And even when it came down to the idea of like using the script, I need to be able to hear it, to feel it. Otherwise, because when there's stuff that's being presented to be felt, it's very differently when it's written. So I try my best to almost get that sense of this is how it would be performed in a place rather than just simply written. So I'm very glad it's reached you in such good time.
Oh,
thank you.
Thank you.
And Bridie, have you retold that story yet to anybody?
No, but do you know something? I was reading about the women who gather and the spiders and the just the way you magically described all of that. And I just thought my little granddaughter was in the garden with me today because we're a little bit less restricted now on lockdown. And she was very frightened of the spiders. So I have that one lined up for Owen as soon as we can get a bit of time.
It was, and my mother's version of that story is very different than my father's, because my mother's version of the idea of going, all these women are constantly working, and most people are frightened of them. You know, and what they're doing is that they're literally there trying to protect people behind them, and there's this fear around them. So, and I think part of it was like the untold labor of women as well. But I do think that once we start knowing where we are in the world and where the world is with us, it becomes less of a frightened place.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
No worries. And I hope your granddaughter, I hope she enjoys it.
Great. Thanks, Bridie. Thanks, Bridie. Anybody else like to make a comment or ask a question?
I actually wanted to say the story about the spider. I studied ethnology, cultural anthropology in Poland, and one of the stories traditionally told by the Polish folks is very much like this: when the Holy Family, when they were escaping prosecution, right after Jesus was born, they were escaping and they were chased by the soldiers, and they came across a spider who took pity on them and woven like a curtain to hide them from the soldiers. And because of that, people in certain areas of Poland believe that it's a bad luck to kill the spider, since it helped the Holy Family. So it's amazing how stories travel.
Yeah, and like that was the story that I actually had heard in school that brought me home all excited to tell my father, who didn't tell me this story. And I think that it's amazing how but stories have always traveled with people, because that's what we are. We are stories.
Yep. Yeah.
Owen, sorry. Yeah. Owen, this is Amy.
Amy.
You know, in the Muslim belief that we're not supposed to we are supposed to protect the spiders as well, because the enemies of the Prophet Muhammad, you know, when he ran into a cave, the spiders quickly, you know, covered it like, you know, like a screen with the webs, you know. So so that's an interesting as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's obviously quite an old story that's traveled and adapted itself to very different places. And I love that. Because like the idea of like stories belong to people, and no matter where they find themselves, it'll retell themselves, and it's just as truthful in every telling, because it brings with it the same sort of like that understanding of like, for instance, we'd all agree like we shouldn't really be killing spiders anyways, you know, that people have are protective of them, and that they're seen as protectors. And then so that one story that has traveled over such a history and time and geographical space has been able to hold intact that same learning, and I think that's something that's very powerful.
Yes.
Hi, Owen. It's Caroline here. Thank you for the story, for the stories, for the book. I read it to students in Canada this week, and there would have been, you know, First Nations there as well. And yeah, we talked about the stories that have traveled and the stories belonging to different tribes and mythology, and they loved your story.
Well, thank you very much. I love the idea of them traveling, but also I always encourage people going, what are your stories? Like for instance, going, most people can't remember the first story they told, you know? But I think that's just the framework of how we engage with storytelling. So the idea of going, what stories do you want to tell the world? Like, for instance, what stories do you choose to tell nieces and nephews and cousins and grandchildren? And so what stories do you actually choose? Because I think that sometimes that says a lot about ourselves, but also when we're not telling stories, it also tells us a lot about how we actually might be unknown to ourselves, be disconnected. Because if we have something that's beautiful and powerful and it resonates with us on such a deep level and through our shared human kinship, and we're not sharing it, what's going on? Have we forgotten of how important and protective and wonderful they are? Are we just busy now with the modern noise of a story? I think that's worth finding out about our own stories and discovering what ones do we have that haven't been shared yet.
Thank you.
And isn't it the case? Oh, and I think with our expanding diversity in our populations, with the so-called new Irish population, that we now have a new audience, not only to tell all our stories to, but to ask them their stories.
Oh yeah.
So we have a wealth of stories landing on the shore every day. And I'm no doubt we'll find a spider story from Nepal, from Algeria, from Gambia, as well as Poland and Malaysia and Tuam and all throughout. So listen, folks, unless anyone's got any more, Garrod, were you going to make a point? Oh, Sinead, would you like to say something? Unmute yourself there, Sinead.
Hi, Owen. Just a quick question. I'm really interested in the connection between storytelling and the handing down of cures and herbal remedies, and how they're absolutely, you know, and your own interest in herbalism, and did that come from the stories of cures being passed down from generation to generation?
Yeah, so a lot of the cures that we would have would be told in stories. Like one that would be with Irma's Let's Go Irma's Voice, which obviously is part of the older cycle. But one of the reasons why that's one of the few stories that within the kind of the wider domain, but I include that on a promise with someone. But then the whole process of just creation of that cure, the idea would be you'd get the onions and you'd cut it so you're allowed to cry. So you're a part of the process of emotional release. And you get the hot scratchers, which means the heat, you know, so you engage it. So we were told recipes in ways through stories so we'd remember them. Because if someone just gives you a recipe, it's probably going to fall out of your head. But if you're told in such a way of like, this is why this happened and this is why this happened. But also a lot of the stories we got were very protective. Like one of the plants that I have a huge fascination with because it's so dangerous and it's absolutely everywhere in the last couple of years is water hemlock, which is just, it's populating all over the place. And it's doing that for a reason because it does clean the waters in certain areas. And the people consider it invasive. I just think it's quite good at its job. But one of our tales was translated as the angel's breath, because the idea would seem to be so dangerous that even the pollen was poisonous. So you're never encouraged to sleep under it because the angel would take you away. So anytime I see that plant, that's the first thing that comes into my mind by going, stay away from it. You know? And so it was so and rather than going in like someone sitting down going, these are the blisters you can get, this is the rashes, this is all like the horrendous kind of like paralytic kind of death that can come upon someone, rather than going, especially young people going, this is the story of the angel breath and why you need to stay away from the plant. You know, so even at that level, at a very young age, we're able to share very serious understandings with people without making it like something of a deep warning. We put it into the narrative of the people. A lot of our cures, because even the word cure comes from stridai, which means to stand in strength. So the idea of cure wasn't just like an act of completion, it was a process. So often even the word cure is almost like something has been cured. And that's not traditionally, it's like the whole process around it, the beliefs around it. And even like some of the cures of even things like warts and the 9 stones and getting them from different people and blessing them and putting them in a crossroads. And it's done on both like the getting dandelions because there's acidic acid in them to eat away at the warts. But even the process of getting stones, I mean, you're letting people know you're really focusing on this, you're putting your mind on it, and you're putting in a place of a crossroads, hoping that it will never follow you again. So you're working on a physical level, a psychological level, and a mythological level. And by pulling them together, you're making quite a potent remedy for yourself, so that you're actually a part of your own healing process rather than just a recipient of something from someone else's advice, that you're actually a part of your own healing. And I think that's incredibly important. And that's something that we're all, no matter settler or traveler, are becoming more and more distant from. Like orthodox medicine has a place, and it needs to be off one arm and another arm working together, because one without the other, like, we're going to lead to chaos. But we need to carry the sheer wisdom, because one of the things my grandmother said when we were young, the reason why we do these things is because they work. Life is hard. If this didn't work, we wouldn't do it. You know, so like, especially people have this idea of just dismissing some remedies, and you're like going, if that wasn't working, people wouldn't be doing it because it doesn't work. You know, so if you're doing it and it's working, it's because of the reason, right? So there's a way of kind of it's verified by the people. So sometimes people think going, oh, superstitious and just pish yoga and pass it away. I go, no, that comes with points of power that are yet to understand.
And Owen, sorry, where can we find out more about your herbal remedy studies? Sorry for cutting across you.
So at the moment, I'm working on something at the moment. I'm in a book, but when it comes to the traditional traveller studies, there's only two things that are really popular in circulation. The Galway Traveller movement did a booklet a couple of years ago, but you need to ring them directly to get it. And it was a small publication. And also there was an Oein McDonough who came second with the Young Scientist Award 3 years ago, and his work was on how the HSE could actually save money by applying traditional travel remedies to certain situations. And what's really interesting is that within the HSE guidelines, there are provisions for traditional traveller healing to take place that most people forget, and some hospitals would be very kind of rejective of. But if you know where to look, like people out to keep the cords, certain medicines that people have made from herb, what you call powders, like certain visitation that the HSE have recognised the importance and validity of it. However, when it comes to the rollout, sometimes it's missing. But I do think that we're all at a loss to forget the wisdom of our elders. Not to be followed blindly, but always to be assessed, knowing that it comes from a place of some sort of truth and understanding that we may not be able to recognise.
Absolutely. Thanks, Owen. Thanks, Sinead. Great question. Anyway, I think we've time. Maybe have we time for one more question? If anybody wants to come in, Gerard, we can't hear you. Your audio isn't working. Keep going. Keep speaking as you're muted there. I think it's the same problem we had last week with your earphones.
It seems to be back now.
No. Not at all.
Do you want to type it? You
can send it in on the chat if you want, Gerard. I have a chat here open, and just while you're doing that, I'll remind everybody once more, for those who haven't got it yet, it's Why the Moon Travels from Skein Press. You can order direct from the publisher or from your local independent bookstore, preferably. And also, as Owen told us, the audiobook is available now, and it's told by a variety of tellers. Owen?
No, one teller who sounded very much like my father, that despite our near interrogation tactics of him, of like, finish the line, he couldn't finish the single story the same way it was written. And that's just because he's a storyteller, you know? Exactly. And he loved the process. But yeah, and the main thing, I'm really glad that people enjoy the stories, but I would really encourage people to share them, but also share your own stories, because undoubtedly you have absolute gems that you've yet to consider.
Yeah. And I mean, on that, well, here we go. Okay, let me tell more of the stories. Sure, there are less stories. So Gerard is asking in the comment that hopefully you will collect and retell more of your stories. To which I know one response would be that we're to do the same. Surely there are less storytellers now than there were, say, 50 years ago.
I think there's less obvious storytellers. The Shanna Key style is no longer intact for many people, but that's for a reason, because it wasn't serving the function that it originally had. Life has changed certain visions, but I do think there are people, like, if you go to social spaces, and going, even like the areas of life, like they have TikTok, the storytellers on TikTok, and on Facebook, on media, in the corners, in the libraries. It's just about how we think our stories, and then how we decide going, that's a story because it fits this template, which is traditional, rather than new form of storytelling is just as valid. Also, poetry, painting, writing, drawing, they're all storytelling, so they're all trying to get a understanding and transfer them, because everyone here is actually a storyteller.
Yes.
You know, and everyone here is actually an artist. We haven't realized and embraced it, because we think those terms belong to the other, or you need to have the formal criteria and credentials, rather than going, no, you're a creative soul and being with ideas and thoughts and ability to share them, regardless of the, like, the high percentage of my mother's family would be hard of hearing or deaf. You know, so there's different ways of telling stories, and they're just as valid. And rather than it being complicated, they add such beautiful additional layers of understanding among stories. And I think that, I think taking on that as a living challenge for our lives is something that I've never seen anyone regret.
So maybe we finish on a note that next time anyone here in the audience finds themselves sitting down at the table with someone and starting a sentence with, wait till I tell you what happened last night. Stop right there and realize you're a storyteller. Would you agree, Owen?
Very, very strongly, and long may the stories travel.
Excellent, excellent. Listen, good mil mahagov, mil buikas. Thank you so much, gracias mil, for joining us and for talking to us today and for enriching all of our lives. Like, I think the nodding heads would agree. Owen, thank you so much.
Well, thank you all very much. I very much appreciate it.
Thanks for making the book. It really, really has brought so much joy and enrichment to all of us, the storytellers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Right. Slán go on,
Okay, everybody.